It has often been said that necessity is the father of invention, which is all well and good, of course, but if innovation is the spawn of necessity, what is the child of desperation? That is what our story is about tonight. It is a tale known as The King's Bounty.
It was autumn of the year 1316. Sir Peter Tremaine found himself once again riding into a small settlement. He didn't even know its name. He and his men just knew they were deeper south than they would have liked. The past few years had been nothing but a wet, miserable experience. There was a part of him that felt bad for these people. They weren't exactly having a better year than he was. However, desperation was not justification for what they had been doing. He already knew they were hiding something. He could see it in the way that they tilted their heads to avoid eye contact. How the town had a faint odor of metal, hinting at blood sloppily being spilled recently. Beyond that, the town was fairly mundane. A few dozen buildings or so, most of which served as houses, with one dark-windowed church sitting at the very center of it all. One of the less guilty-looking villagers asked if he was from the church, if he was a priest. He answered that he was sent by the church, but he was no priest. Several of the people recoiled. They knew what he was, and why he'd come. Some were frightened, while others looked angry. He didn't blame them. Maybe if he didn't come from such wealth, he would have been just like them. It was bad everywhere, really. The floods had destroyed so much. Every day there was some story about one farm or another, or a small village suddenly washing away or sinking into the mud. Of course, this said nothing of the stories of crime. Lunatics running around the countryside, concealing their features while praising unholy names. It didn't help that the royals and the churches were more worried about keeping food on their own plates than helping the populations. Meanwhile, merchants were unleashed to charge whatever they wanted for their salt and wheat. There had been some times where he found himself wondering, where was God? Comfortable in a church or a palace? With these people? With him? Would God even recognize any of them? There was only so much people could take before they became more hungry than sane, after all, which is where he came in. He hated his work. It kept him and his family fed, yes, but he knew deep down it was clawing away at his mind. Months ago, when it all started, he foolishly believed that he would get used to it. What a bloody fool he was. As if there was any way to look past people covered in mud ripping hunks of meat off of horses and dogs and not wanting to vomit. Worst of all was these people, who acted like animals, had the nerve to call him such ignorant names. Witch hunter, inquisitor, church dog. Like they had any right to denounce him with bits of vile meat unfit for human consumption between their teeth. He was an enforcer not just of the law of man and God, but an upholder of a standard, the only thing that kept these filthy peasants even remotely human. He got off his horse, followed by his men, and ordered each building to be searched without exception. Several of the townsfolk protested, of course, but most fell silent when his men drew their swords. Peter simply sighed and made his way into the church at the center of town, while his men forced their way into the homes. As he walked up the steps, he noticed that the bricks had been stained. One of the villagers stepped towards him and whispered that they had no choice. He wouldn't have helped them if they didn't prove that they were grateful. Sir Peter could only sigh again. He wished he hadn't heard things like that before. The moment things were difficult, people ran away from God into the comforting arms of anything that could make them feel happy. Part of him was angry. How stupid could these people be, trading their immortal soul away for a full stomach? The villager begged Peter to just walk away. Just let them survive. Peter almost laughed in his face. Survive? What good is survival if it costs you your humanity? Your soul? He didn't even bother answering the filthy bastard. He just kicked the door to the church open and promptly screamed in terror. The whole building had been gutted in every way that it could have been. Dark, thick fluids were smeared upon the walls. Paintings and banners were caked with strange circular patterns, and an unsettling, earthly stench wafted all over. There was no space of the building left untouched, and at the far end of the main chamber, where the altar had once been, Peter saw the very apex of heresy. At first it simply looked like a huge pile of gore, but the longer that he looked at it, the more it seemed to change. He realized it had a rough shape, like a towering nightmare with black-stained fabric draped over its raised limbs. A huge wolf-headed bat with bones, broken glass, and pieces of metal stabbed into its head like a twisted crown. Peter felt a nagging mix of emotions. It was horrific to see, and yet there almost seemed some kind of nobility to it. He finally forced himself to look away from the thing, and saw an old man standing in the church doorway. Peter drew his sword and demanded the name of this demon that the town had flocked to. The elder lowered his head and uttered, "The unformed king, Prince Razolf." Something about the name in particular upset Peter. That was what they would call a prince? A king? The elder claimed that they found a stone in a nearby field. It had been revealed during the flooding. At first they thought it was just a big rock, but when they laid hands upon it, they felt its power. They set it aside in a barn, and after that the whole village began to have profound dreams. Each recounted seeing their new savior, although no two described it exactly the same way. It even spoke to some of them, with a voice like shattering glass. It warned of coming dangers, though to others it was oddly friendly and even curious itself, though most of the people who dreamed of it only beheld his majesty and then woke screaming or crying. Hearing all this, Peter ordered everyone in the village be interrogated at once. The process dragged on well into the night, and Peter felt an odd drowsiness creeping over him. He gave his men the order to continue questioning the villagers while he rested. While walking away from them, he glanced once more at the desecrated church, and felt a chill rush up and down his spine. From his view through the open doorway, he was sure that ugly pagan effigy had moved. He told himself it couldn't have, and even if it did, it was so poorly put together it was probably just falling apart. He laid down in a bed inside of a house he commandeered. The house, like everything else in the countryside, was miserable, damp, cold, and dark. He missed his own house, his wife, his children. He wondered what they were doing. Were they hungry? Was some madness creeping upon them just like it did this town? He found it hard to fall asleep. He was hounded by the feeling that somebody was watching him. He could almost see a dark figure standing in the corner of the room. He knew there wasn't anyone there, of course, but somehow the shadows bent in just the right way that he could almost make out the folds of a heavy robe. The unwelcome thoughts of the strange idol in the church invaded his mind, making him toss and turn before he finally fell asleep. He woke suddenly to the sound of drums, though, only to realize he was no longer in the bed, or even in a house for that matter. He sat upon a grassy field, but everything was wrong. The sky, the clouds, grass, and trees were all different colors. Looking around, he found that his clothes and his sword were both gone. He quickly got to his feet, and could see no sign of his belongings at all. The only thing he could detect was a fervent and distant drumming. He told himself it was a dream. It had to be. He allowed a sense of anger to embolden him. This had to be some devil work. Those filthy villagers worked some witchcraft upon him, forcing this dreadful vision. He knew he had to face this evil trickery. So he walked towards the sound of the drums, reciting the Lord's Prayer with each step. He had repeated it fully 3 times before finally coming to the top of a hill. Looking down, he saw the source of the drumming. Far below him was a throng of inhuman creatures, dancing or thrashing about. No two looked the same. Some were furred while others were scaled. Some appeared to be partially formed. They all shouted and pranced about, while others were pounding on drums. Peter quickly noticed that there was no great idol or figure among them. He then realized a disturbing question. If this was a ritual for some regional demon, where was the guest of honor? Suddenly he heard soft footsteps behind him. He turned and came face to face with a tall figure in flowing black robes, wearing a distorted and bent crown on its head. Peter felt his heart skip a beat as fear jolted through him. He couldn't see its face, but deep down he knew he didn't want to anyway, though he did try to look bold in spite of his trembling hands. He asked the crowned creature's name. It spoke in an unexpectedly soft voice, only uttering the vile name the villager had said before. Razoth. Peter attempted to mock the creature, claiming that it looked more threatening back in the church, but Razoth merely made a strange, snickering sound before shrugging and tipping his head as if to bow. Peter asked why he was seeing all this. Razoth stepped forward, whispering that he meant no harm, though it only sent Peter's whole body into shaking violently. His voice cracked as he tried to keep his footing. He asked Razoth what he intended to do with this village. Razoth merely claimed he was only offering the aid that he was asked for. Peter asked him what would compel a creature like him to do such a thing, but Razoth could only shrug in response. Peter wasn't sure how much more time he wanted to spend near this creature, so he asked Razoth one final question. What did he do to help this village? The demon rose one arm, revealing an ugly hand partially covered in short, fine black fur, with long, thin digits like the legs of a spider. A thick, fat tentacle started to grow from the creature's palm, like a leech, bloating and swelling itself as it fed. Then, Razoth uttered one final word, a word whose implications were so horrible, they shattered Peter's mind and made him awake screaming and sobbing. He stumbled out of his bed and didn't even bother putting his clothes on, instead choosing to just race out into the town in his undergarments. He found his men questioning one of the villagers. Everyone stared at him in bewilderment, till finally he shouted a single word, the word that he had heard before he woke up. Meat. The villager's face paled. That was what that thing, that demon, had given them. Peter berated the villager, cursing them and the entire village as fools. He asked what sort of meat was worth sacrificing the sanctity of a church, their minds and their very souls. The villager just looked at the ground and muttered that that was not all they sacrificed. Peter and his men ordered the villager to take them to where the meat and the stone was located. The villager admitted that they were together in an old barn just at the edge of the village. And so, at Sword Point, Peter marched the villager to the barn. Standing before it, Peter could almost hear the drums from his dream. It was just before sunrise, and so they needed torches to see. As the doors opened, a disgusting, damp stench rushed out over everyone. His men gagged and coughed. One glanced into the barn, then dropped his torch. He turned and ran away screaming and crying for God to deliver him from evil. Peter took a deep breath. He remembered the dark figure of his dream. He told himself that he was ready to face whatever hell was hiding in the shadows of that barn. And then, under his breath, he prayed to his Lord that he was telling the truth. Walking into the barn was like walking into the mouth of a giant beast. Bloated, soft, pink flesh covered the walls, the support beams, and even the floor. The worst part was how healthy it all looked. It pulsed and twitched at Peter's touch. He could feel the flesh tensing up underneath his feet. He wished he had thought to put boots on. A spindly tendril of flesh rose up towards him. He swung out with his sword and hacked it off. With a thick black ooze gushing up from the flesh, Peter watched in horror as the stub stopped bleeding and closed. A villager shouted into the barn that the sword wouldn't help, because the flesh grew faster than it could be cut. They didn't only eat the meat because they were hungry, but because they had to hack it up to stop him from growing beyond the barn. Peter closed his eyes and took a sharp breath. He wished he hadn't heard that. This thing, the thing he was standing inside of, had been a man once. He understood these people were starving, so they asked for food. And the strange thing that was somehow tied to this stone gave them exactly what they asked for. Meat. All the meat they could possibly eat. He stepped further into the barn and finally found it. An unassuming piece of rock, maybe the size of a pig, with a black circular pattern carved onto it. The same pattern he had seen at the church, and beside it was a large, swollen mound of flesh. He shuddered in horror seeing a face, a man's face, on the growth. It whispered to him of a king. Seeing it, Peter knew this was all that was left of the poor fool that the village had trusted to guard the stone. The damned man who the demon had corrupted. Moving through the stone, it had grown and spread him out for the others to eat. Part of him was sickened, but more than that, he felt pity. Was it really their fault that they fell to such a dreadful thing? What could they have done in the face of hunger and this demon? He even questioned himself. Could he really have resisted this Razov? Even in a mere dream, his mind all but completely crumbled before it. He wondered how well his family would have endured the hunger, the floods, the demon. He rose his sword high up over the tragic thing that had once been a human, and swore that he would make this as painless as possible. He then plunged his weapon down into the mound, and it screamed before tensing up, and then relaxing. He didn't pull the sword out. He was afraid it would allow the thing to heal and resume living. Instead, he just watched it for several minutes. He felt sure that it was finally dead, so he turned and steadied his nerves as he shouted for his men to bring tinder and torches. He looked down at the stone. It was the only thing the flesh wasn't covering. He didn't understand the pattern, or what it meant, but he hated it. He hated the evil creature it had brought to this village. Anger welled up inside him to the point, for no reason, he swung out, punching the stone. When his hand touched the rock, his head was thrown back. His jaw hung open as he saw a vision. Ages ago, in a time before the village, before these people, before anyone ever uttered a prayer, even before anything remotely human walked the earth, the land was open with coiling plants and unnamed animals darting across fields. There was something beautiful about it. It was so pure and old, empty of the struggles and bickering of humanity. At the center of this frighteningly peaceful scene stood a massive stone obelisk, covered in strange markings he didn't know. The calm scene was disturbed as an ugly black slime rose up, pulling itself over the pillar. It shook and rippled while producing an ear-splitting cry. Peter didn't know why, but he knew this slime had a name. Something deep within him knew this was the true self of the nightmare that had become the god of this field, this land, maybe even this world long before his lord. Older than sin, and far more complex, more powerful than any force of hell. Peter fell to his knees while the slime continued to shift and pull itself away from the stone, taking on a strange shape, spreading itself out thin, like a terrible dragon with membranous wings. with a head like a long-eared wolf, topped with a bent and cracked crown. Peter reached up to the thing with tears in his eyes, finally seeing through the illusions of his wants and beliefs. The vision suddenly vanished. Peter rubbed the tears from his face and pulled himself to his feet. His men shouted to him if they should still burn the barn down. Peter pulled his sword out from the mound of flesh and slowly started walking back to the doorway. By the time he got to his men, he could hear the poor face in the mound wailing as it grew back to life. Peter didn't so much as blink as he pushed his sword into the gut of one of his men, and the villagers all pounced, using any objects they could grab to beat the remaining men to death. Peter watched the violence with indifference as he walked towards the church, dragging his bloody sword behind him. Even as his men screamed and tried to hack the villagers to pieces before they were pulverized, Peter let the sword drop from his hand as he entered the church. The sounds of fighting slowly faded away, and Peter knelt before the great idol. He felt the eyes of the villagers upon him. He looked at them and felt a strange sense of relief. No more concern for sanity or sanctity. The laws of man and God were so far away now. They could not and would not burden him ever again. He looked back to the idol, finally feeling the blessing that this village had been gifted. He weakly smiled as he rose up his hand and whimpered softly, "Hail the unformed king."
Donec diutorum convenient.
Church dog.